This lens costs 35 times more than this lens. And today we're going to be talking about what makes them different and why this is so much more expensive. I'm here today in Finland, and in a few hours I'm heading into Aperture, but I've got a little bit of time spare, so I thought I'd talk about the difference between these two lenses. This one is the Canon CN20. It's a super 35 lens, and it's got a zoom range from 50 to 1000 millimeters with an inbuilt teleconverter that takes it up to 1500 millimeters. This one is the Sigma 60 to 600, and it is more of a stills lens for photography, but it's really good for filming wildlife as well. This lens comes in an EF and a PL mount, whereas this lens comes in a load of mounts: EF, Nikon, Sony E, Leica L, and a few others as well. This is my personal lens, the Sigma, and I chose this lens because the zoom range is 10 times zoom, and it's probably the closest equivalent range to the 20 times of the CN20. So that's why I got this, because I can't afford this lens. And let's talk about price. This is $70,000, whereas this one is about $2,000. This is 35 times more expensive than this. So you could get 35 of these lenses for one of these. And that's quite insane to me, really. It's the price of a car. What do you get for the money? It's a custom designed lens for wildlife filmmakers. That's what you get. It's just over 40 centimeters long. It weighs about 6.5 kilos versus this one, which is about just under 30 centimeters long and weighs 2.5 kilos. But when you zoom in on this one, it goes all the way up to 38 centimeters. So it's pretty long, nearly as long as this one. It doesn't weigh as much, but the fact that this extends when it zooms means that your tripod becomes unbalanced, and as you zoom in, it starts to tilt down. So you have to rebalance your camera each time you zoom in. Whereas this one, when you zoom in, it stays the same length. And so the zoom is internal, and it doesn't shift the weight and the weight balance of the tripod. The iris on these cameras is similar. This one starts at T5 and goes throughout the range up to about 560 mils, stays at 5, and then as you get towards 1000 it ramps down to I think 8.9. So you see, if you're wide open and zoom in, as you get to the far end of the lens, you see a noticeable ramp down in brightness. But the same thing happens on this lens. It's I think 4.5 to 6.3 aperture, so as you zoom in you do get a little drop off in brightness and exposure. So similar, I think it's just a challenge of physics really, that you can't have such a big zoom range without having that drop in exposure unless you have a huge lens. There is a Fujinon that has an even bigger zoom range than this. It's 25 to 1000, but it's a 2.8, but it weighs 30 kilos. So the fact that this is relatively lightweight is pretty miraculous, really. The iris on the Canon is a manual iris, so just done by hand. It can be controlled by the Servo, which we'll talk about later, but this one is a electronic iris. Maybe the Nikon one has a manual one, but all of them have to be controlled by the camera, so you need a camera that has an electronic mount and is able to control the lens internally. So it does it on the FX6, and you can do it on the Red as well, but not all cameras are able to control this lens manually. So if you don't have an electronic mount for it, then you'd be stuck wide open. You'll notice they've both got quite big front elements. This one's 110 millimeters across, this one's 136 millimeters across. Means that if you want filtration for the front, you're going to have to get quite big, quite expensive filters, because they have to cover quite a large area. So that's why I tend to use the rear NDs at the back, and I'm just careful in terms of scratches and stuff with this lens. I just quite careful with it. Replacing a front element on one of these is expensive. Image quality. As you'd expect, the image quality of this lens is really, really good. It is used on 4K, 8K cameras and has been for the last 10 years really. It's pretty much any wildlife sequence, any wildlife documentary that you've seen in the last 10 years has been shot using this lens. So it's the go-to, and you know the quality is really good. If you use a teleconverter, you do lose a little bit of quality, but not much. It is a really good lens. And likewise, the Sigma is really, really good. It's certainly not 35 times worse than the Canon. It's a really, really nice lens. The quality holds up. It's a good lens, and I've used it up at 4K loads, and it holds up really nicely. So yeah, not a bad lens. Let's talk about focus. The CN20 is a manual focus lens. There's no autofocus on it at all, and it has a huge focus barrel at the front of the lens. It's really smooth, and it has about 180 degree rotation, so I can't quite get a full focus throw with one hand. You can maybe just about do it from infinity to close, but you can nearly do it, and that distance means that for the distances that we're generally focusing, you've got a nice ability to feather and pull the focus really carefully. This one, on the other hand, is about 120 degrees of focus, and that is nice as well. It's not quite as good because it's got autofocus. You don't have hard end stops at the end of the lens, which makes manual calibration for follow focuses tricky. But yeah, the focus is all right on this. It's not too bad. The one thing that does happen on this one that doesn't happen on this is this one isn't parfocal. So when you zoom in, the focus changes. And so as you zoom in, you have to keep adjusting focus. Whereas this one, because it's parfocal, you can zoom in and focus and then zoom out, and the focus will stay the same throughout that zoom range. It's got a back focus adjustment here, which means you can calibrate that and make sure that that back focus stays throughout the entire range. And that is one of the things that makes this lens really, really good. You can zoom right in, close up on the animal, get your focus, and then zoom out to your composition and know that that focus will be still where you want it to be. So really, really useful part of this. Nice focusing action, and then also that parfocal ability of the lens. The minimum focus on this lens is 3.6 meters, and the minimum focus on this is about, well, it varies throughout the zoom range from 0.6 meters to 2.6 meters. As you zoom in, the focus gets further away. This lens also has image stabilization. Generally, I'll keep it turned off because it reacts weirdly with the tripod, whereas this lens, no image stabilization, no autofocus. Okay, so let's talk about this box on the side before the sun goes in too much. This is where the magic happens. This is the servo. And what this allows is it can control the focus, the iris, and the zoom. And it's got a button on top that you can zoom in and out, but it also has a cable that you can plug in, and it means that you can use a zoom demand. So how generally this lens is used for wildlife is you'll have someone focusing with their hand at the front and then zoom on the panhandle at the back. And that means that you can be watching what's going on and zooming and focusing at the same time. And so you can keep your frame while you're changing composition. Whereas this one, I have tried to set it up electronically using a remote follow focus, using a tilter nucleus, but I just can't get it to work well enough. It often skips. You have to put lens gears on the lens. Certainly to get the zoom, it's quite stiff, and so getting the motor to engage properly and not lift off is really tricky. I actually tried it before this to try and compare the two, but I couldn't get it to work properly. I tend to just use it zoom by hand and then also focus by hand. You can use a follow focus, but I tend to just, on this one, do it by hand. The servo box can also plug in to a follow focus. So there is a Canon follow focus that will plug directly into this, so you can have the follow focus. In fact, when they're using it on live sports, they have the zoom on one hand and the follow focus at the other hand at the back, whereas we use it with the follow focus up towards the front generally, and the hand on the back for the zoom. And in broadcast settings, they'll often plug in to the truck for the iris, and so there's someone in the gallery watching who controls the exposure of this camera, so they can match the exposures across multiple cameras, whereas we tend to just have it on manual and just adjust it as we go along. And talking about zoom and using the servo to zoom, the range on this is phenomenal. It's a 50 to 1000mm lens with an inbuilt 1.5 converter, so your range is essentially from 50 to 1500, whereas this one is 60 to 600. But we're not quite comparing like with like here, because this is a Super 35 lens on a Super 35 camera. So if we were to convert that to full frame equivalents, just for a side-by-side how they look, this would be the equivalent to a 75mm to 2250mm on full frame, which is ridiculous. It's nearly 4 times longer than the 600 of this one. So 600 versus 2250 on the long end on a full frame equivalent, which crazy feat of engineering from the guys at Canon. Let's talk about why this lens is 35 times more than this one. And I think we need to talk about how it's used. This is for filmmakers. I think it was even designed for wildlife filmmakers by Canon, so it is a specific lens for quite a small set of people. There's not a massive number of professional wildlife filmmakers, and so it's a small market, and there isn't a huge amount of demand, and it's really well engineered, very high-end stuff, whereas this is a much more mass market, and so there will be many more of these in the world than there are of these. And so I suppose that, in the first instance, dictates why this is more expensive. But also, there's very few people who have their own CN20. Most of the time, it's productions and rental companies who have these, and then they'll just be hired in for the production that is using it. But I would always ask for one of these on a long lens shoot, because they make our lives so easy. You have the zoom demand on the handle, so you can zoom in really easily. You can crash in for focus, crash in to reframe. It makes it easy. The focus is really nice. The range of the lens means that you can sit a bit further back, not affect the animal's behaviour. So all of these things go together to make it a really good lens. And the fact that it's light enough to chuck in a backpack, take wherever you want. It's designed for us, and it is the right tool for the job. But the Sigma is definitely not 35 times worse than this. You can get really nice footage, really nice results from the Sigma, and it gets you a good way there. It's not the same as this, and it's never intended to be the same as this. So they're two different lenses, but it's a really good lens. And I think that, yeah, I'm glad that I have this. When I'm out on my own or doing lower budget productions, then this is a pretty good surrogate for this, because it gets you a good amount of the way there. It's obviously not the same, but for the amount of money that it costs, it does an amazing job. Hopefully this has sort of explained the difference between these two lenses, and maybe given you an insight into why this one is so expensive but also so worth it. I'm heading out soon. I've been blethering for far too long, but I'm heading out soon to film the bears. So if you want to see what I'm up to and see more of that footage, then stay tuned, and I'll be posting that footage up soon. And hit the subscribe, hit notifications so you see it all. You know what the score is. And yeah, until then, just embrace time outside. Go and enjoy nature, whether it's with a camera or without. It's an amazing place to be, and yeah, see you then.